Thank you so much for the opportunity to present our work in this conference. And this is a joint work with two colleagues from the International Monetary Fund, and a disclaimer that all the views expressed in this presentation will be those of the authors and not representative of the International Monetary Fund, its management, or its board. So this paper is titled, "Who Bears the Brunt of Lockdown Policies?" And we are using evidence from teleworkability measures that we construct for many countries available in the PIAAC survey. And this paper has since been accepted for publication. So it will be forthcoming at the IMF Economic Review. And let me begin. Okay, so as we know, social distancing policies that were adopted to curb the spread of the pandemic and the unprecedented impact that it had on the labor markets around the world, especially in the early months of the pandemic. And that resulted in millions of workers being laid off or furloughed, and workers and occupations requiring physical presence at the workplace, especially in the contact intensive settings, have been the most impacted because first their scope of working from home was limited. And in this paper, we're trying to answer several questions. First, what do we know about these workers? And how do these workers differ across countries? And most importantly, what are the long-term implications of this pandemic on labor markets? And in this project, we address these questions for 35 advanced and emerging market economies using our index of teleworkability or feasibility to work from home. We identify the pockets of vulnerability by studying the distribution of employment at risk across different demographic groups, sectors, occupations, and as I mentioned, across countries. And we also examine the country-specific drivers of the extent of teleworkability and focusing specifically on differential access to technology. So how do we construct this index of teleworkability? So using this expectation maximization algorithm, we relate occupational teleworkability score that is developed by Dingle and Niemann to individual worker and task characteristics. And why is it important to develop an individual level as opposed to occupational level index? As Siddharth already mentioned in his presentation, many occupations across advanced and emerging economies, for instance, can involve very different tasks and have different levels of technology use. So even within a given occupation, workers could be performing different activities depending, for example, on the size of the firm that they're working in, since for smaller firms generally have less access to advanced technology. So our index allows us to relax the assumptions that occupations look basically the same across countries and examine these key differences at the individual level. So we pair the occupational estimates from Dingle and Niemann with the PIAAC. And as we know, PIAAC is a large-scale nationally representative survey that is aimed at measuring skills and competencies of workers, as well as task characteristics that workers perform in their day-to-day jobs. So it covers 30 OECD countries in our case, and we also use samples from the 5 non-OECD countries, including Ecuador, Singapore, and Kazakhstan, and a couple of others. So the resulting sample contains about 157,000 respondents. Okay, so let me just jump straight into results. First, I'm going to plot average levels of teleworkability index by occupation and sector. And we do so for the entire sample of countries and then for each country specifically. And here we just show the the minimum and the maximum values of Teleworkability Index for these specific countries. So at the occupational level, we showed that elementary occupations like janitors, construction laborers, street vendors are least able to work from home. And then they're followed by plant and machinery operators and craft and related trade workers like mechanics and garment workers. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have professionals, managers, officials, and legislators. Those are the occupations that are most amenable to working from home. At the sector level, on average, workers with a lower scope for working from home are concentrated in accommodation and food services, then transportation, wholesale and retail trade, health and social services, and manufacturing sectors. And within these sectors, essential activities in critical supply chains like food, pharmaceuticals, deliveries, healthcare, and some types of essential manufacturing have been exempt from lockdown restrictions, especially in the early months of the pandemic in most countries, but the index doesn't necessarily capture those exemptions. So by contrast, sectors that are best suited for teleworking include information and communication services, finance and insurance, and professional services like legal and scientific research. So these sectors typically require less physical proximity and have higher reliance on digital tools and different technologies. And as in the case of the occupations, there seemed to be a negative association between the level of economic development of a given country and the feasibility to work remotely within a given sector. So workers in Finland and Singapore, for example, have higher index scores even in the less teleworkable sectors, such as manufacturing and retail. And that could signal greater use of digital technologies in these countries. Okay, so here we're plotting cross-country variation in Teleworkability Index that we construct. And there's quite a bit of variation in the teleworkability levels. And this figure shows on the left-hand side the clear association between the level of economic development and the average ability to work remotely. Emerging countries like Turkey, Mexico, Peru tend to stand out with significantly lower average teleworkability scores. And this suggests that workers in emerging and developing economies face more challenges in continuing to work during periods of lockdowns. And within advanced economies, Greece and Italy, they have among the lowest teleworkability scores, while their Nordic counterparts and Singapore have the highest scores, reflecting, again, a relatively more developed digital infrastructure, which we see on the right-hand side chart. Here, we further explore whether cross-country heterogeneity in teleworkability is linked to differences in countries' level of digital connectivity. And we use data on the percentage of population using internet from the World Development Indicators. And we find that internet use, again, which is the key for working from home, is positively correlated with cross-country estimates of Teleworkability Index that we construct. And even in our sample of advanced and emerging market economies, we found that only about 85% of population had internet access in 2019-2020 period, for which the data are available. And this figure is actually significantly lower in emerging market economies like Peru, Ecuador, Turkey, Mexico, here concentrated at the bottom. And there, less than 75% of population actually had access to internet. And then even within Europe, Italy and Greece lag significantly behind their Nordic counterparts. Okay, so next we get to the level of demographic characteristics. And we look at the effect of lockdown policies on workers in specific demographic categories and the resulting implications for inequality. So we correlate demographic characteristics with the Tele-workability index. And for that, we regress the index on different binary variables that include things like whether respondent is a male, older than 60 or younger than 30, whether respondent was born abroad, works part-time, belongs to the bottom two or the top two deciles of earning distribution, and whether the respondent has a college degree. And we also include country fixed effects in the pooled regression. And then when we rerun this regression, interacting these demographic characteristics with the country dummies, we obtain the country-specific estimates and then compare them to this cross-country average results. So the chart here on the right shows coefficients on each of the individual characteristics, as well as the minimum and maximum country-specific coefficients value. And if we look at the first category, for example, the blue dot tells us that the non-college educated workers have on average lower teleworkability level, and this holds for all countries. However, in Spain, the gap between college and non-college workers is actually wider. So overall, we showed that vulnerable groups of workers that are at higher risk of layoffs during lockdowns ordered to contain the spread of the virus, they're concentrated in smaller firms, in part-time employment. These workers are younger. They tend to be not college educated, and they tend to be concentrated in the bottom of the income distribution. And we find that men on average are less likely to be engaged in work activities that can be performed at home compared to women. Japan is an exception here, and there is very little difference in teleworkability levels of men and women. So this evidence suggests that women are potentially less affected by lockdown orders, but as we know, during lockdowns, women were more likely to shoulder the majority of the care work for the sick and for the children, and that affected their productivity and their employment levels. So women are also disproportionately represented in the most impacted sectors like accommodation and retail services. And as a result, although they do have higher levels of teleworkability, they were nevertheless more impacted in terms of employment. So we also showed that foreign-born workers on average are significantly more likely to belong to occupations which are less amenable to teleworking. And there's some variation across advanced and emerging countries that suggests selection in terms of the skill level of the immigrants. And next, workers in smaller firms with fewer than 250 employees are less likely to be able to work from home. Again, this could be a result of lower rates of technology adoption among small firms. Also, smaller firms tend to have less of a capital cushion, more liquidity constrained, and overall, they're just less likely to survive these periods of lockdowns. And finally, we showed that workers in part-time employment or temporary jobs are also less likely to work remotely. Okay, so individual level here, estimates of teleworkability index allow us to evaluate the distributional impact of the lockdown policies across countries. So first, we showed that workers in the bottom two deciles of the hourly earnings distribution are significantly less likely to be able to work remotely than workers in the top two deciles. And across countries, workers in the bottom deciles are also more likely to live hand to mouth and to have just lower financial buffers when it comes to savings and access to credit. And the intergenerational inequality level, on average, having a college degree greatly improves the likelihood of working remotely across all age groups. But older workers with lower levels of education still have higher levels of teleworkability. So this could reflect a natural progression into more senior level occupations over one's career. And again, these findings suggest that earnings gap between generations could further exacerbate during the crisis. So to conclude, in this paper, we validate our findings against the actual quarterly employment hours and GDP data in 2020. We're not showing it here, but it's in the paper. We find that Teleworkability Index is actually strongly correlated with realized sectoral employment changes during the pandemic, even when controlling for the role of government-provided economic support, like employment retention policies, income support, debt relief during the pandemic, and the share of service occupations in the economy. And overall, we showed that workers with lower scores on Teleworkability Index tend to be more economically vulnerable. Those are workers that are younger, with fewer years of education, engaging in part-time work, and those with earnings that are in the bottom of the income distribution. And many of these workers' characteristics coalesce in the hardest hit occupations and sectors. And all of these findings really point that the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to exacerbate intergenerational income inequality. And with acceleration of the automation trend, these changes are most likely to be long lasting. And so from the policymakers' point of view, expanding social insurance and safety nets to protect these vulnerable groups of population, investing in policies to alleviate the burden of childcare, investing in digital technologies, strengthening education and training to prepare workers for more automated workplace are all important steps, and that could be taken immediately. Thank you very much for your attention. And again, please let me know if you have any questions.